The air in the tent was thick with the smell of wet wool, gunpowder, and blood. Outside, a cold October rain fell on the Ohio country, turning the ground to a churned, muddy soup. The man on the crude stretcher knew he was dying. The musket ball had shattered his upper arm, and the French surgeon had just shaken his head, whispering about la gangrène. But the pain that contorted his face was more than physical. It was the anguish of a man caught between two worlds, a man who had fought for a king, become a brother to a nation, and was now, as the shadows lengthened, seen as a monster by the very people who owed him their survival. His name was William, but for over 20 years they had called him by a name that would echo through American history, a name that would become synonymous with both savage betrayal and desperate survival. Simon Girty. And this is not his story alone. It is the story of the brutal, jagged, and utterly forgotten frontier where the American nation was forged in fire. A story where there were no white hats or black hats, only varying shades of bloody earth and ash. William was born in 1741 near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, into a world of volatile borders. His childhood was the hardscrabble norm for frontier settlers until 1756, when the delicate peace of his family shattered. During the French and Indian War, a band of Seneca warriors and French officers descended on their farm. His father was killed. Young William, then just 15, his brother and his mother were taken captive. This moment was the first great fracture in his life. He was adopted by the Seneca, specifically the Mingo people, and given the name Katepkoman. He learned their language, their skills, their spiritual view of the land. He became, in essence, one of them. For 3 years he lived as a Mingo, until he was eventually reclaimed by the British in a prisoner exchange. Returned to colonial society, Girty was an alien in his own skin. He served as an interpreter and scout for the British during Pontiac's War, his fluency in several native languages making him invaluable. But he had seen the other side. He understood the tribes not as faceless savages, but as complex societies fighting for their very existence against an endless tide of settlers who saw the forest only as lumber and the land only as acreage. This understanding festered within him as the years passed and the pressure on the frontier grew. The American Revolution erupted, and the Ohio River Valley became a theater of horrifying violence. For the native nations, the Shawnee, Delaware, Wyandot, and Mingo, this was not a war about taxation or representation. It was a final, desperate struggle. They saw the rebellious colonists as the greater threat, the land-hungry swarm. The British, from their posts at Detroit and Fort Niagara, were happy to arm and encourage them, using native raids as a terror weapon to bleed the frontier settlements dry. Girty had to choose a side. In 1778, he made his fateful decision. Stationed at Fort Pitt, formerly Fort Duquesne, as a scout for the American militia, he grew disgusted with the contempt and brutality shown by frontier leaders like Colonel Daniel Brodhead towards the very tribes Girty called kin. When a group of American officers accused him of treason on flimsy evidence, it was the final straw. He slipped out of the fort one night with 3 other disillusioned frontiersmen and made for the British stronghold at Detroit. He offered his services to the British Indian Department, not out of love for King George, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty to his native friends and a burning hatred for the expansionist American frontiersmen. And so, Simon Girty became the Great Renegade. To the terrified settlers huddled in their stockades along the Ohio and Kentucky rivers, Girty was the devil incarnate. He was the white man who led the savages. He was the face at the edge of the firelight, screaming taunts in perfect English, urging the warriors on. His knowledge of frontier tactics and settlements made the native war parties terrifyingly effective. The stories grew with each retelling, that he personally tortured prisoners, that he laughed as children were killed, that he was a fiend in human form. The reality, as is often the case, was more tragic and nuanced. Girty did participate in raids. He was present at some of the most brutal engagements of the frontier war, like the 1782 attack on the fortified station of Estill Station in Kentucky. But numerous accounts from prisoners who survived captivity, often because of Girty's direct intervention, tell a different tale. He frequently used his influence to save prisoners from torture and death. At the infamous Battle of Blue Licks in 1782, where a Kentuckian force was ambushed and decimated, Girty was seen trying to calm the warriors and prevent the killing of surrendering men. He argued, bargained, and risked his own standing to save lives. He was a man constantly negotiating the line between his adopted loyalties and the remnants of his birth culture. His most famous and most complex moment came with the capture of Colonel William Crawford in 1782. Crawford, a friend of George Washington, led a punitive expedition into Ohio that went disastrously wrong. Captured by Delaware warriors, Crawford was condemned to death by torture in retaliation for the Gnadenhutten massacre earlier that year, where American militia had murdered nearly 100 pacifist, Christian Delaware men, women, and children in cold blood. Girty was present at Crawford's execution. The stories that rocketed back to the settlements claimed Girty laughed and mocked Crawford. Eyewitness accounts from other prisoners, however, suggest a different scene. They reported that Girty, clearly distressed, spoke with the Delaware chiefs for a long time, trying desperately to secure Crawford's release or a quicker death. He was unable to sway them. The Delaware were enacting a bitter justice for Gnadenhutten. When he finally had to interpret the death sentence to Crawford, his voice was said to be hollow, his face ashen. He gave Crawford what small comforts he could: a blanket to sit on, a pipe of tobacco. He did not laugh. He watched, a prisoner of his own choices, as a man from his old world met a horrific end. This moment cemented his legend as a monster in American folklore, but it reveals the agony of a man trapped in a moral nightmare. When the Revolution ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the ultimate betrayal, from Girty's and his native allies' perspective, was complete. The British, without a single consultation with their native allies, ceded all the lands south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi to the United States. The tribes, who had fought as Britain's allies, were now abandoned, their homelands handed over to their enemies. For Girty, it was a devastating confirmation of the cynicism of empires. He stayed in the West, living among the Shawnee and Wyandot, a permanent exile. He continued to fight, now against the new American Republic, supporting the brilliant Shawnee leader Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, the Prophet, in their pan-tribal confederacy. He was at the disastrous Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794 and saw the Confederacy's hopes crushed again at the Battle of the Thames in 1813, where Tecumseh was killed. An old, broken man, despised by the Americans and a living reminder of a lost cause to the tribes, Girty fled to Canada with the British retreat. He died in 1818 on a farm near Amherstburg, Ontario, a bitter and lonely figure. In his final years, he was blind and often drunk, haunted by the ghosts of both sides of the frontier. His death was noted with a brief, spiteful paragraph in American newspapers, celebrating the passing of a notorious renegade and savage. But to simply label Simon Girty a traitor or a monster is to miss the profound, unsettling truth his life represents. He was a product of the American frontier, that terrifying and fertile ground where identities were stripped and remade. He embodied its central tragic contradiction, the collision between an irresistible expansion and an immovable civilization. He chose a side, yes, but he chose the side of the doomed, the side that was fighting to preserve a world that was already vanishing. In doing so, he held up a mirror to the new American nation, reflecting back not a heroic myth of wilderness conquest, but the brutal, morally ambiguous, and often savage reality of its birth. The rain finally stopped on that October night in 1818. Simon Girty, the white savage, the great renegade, Capitoman of the Mingo, drew a last ragged breath. With him died not just a man, but an entire understanding of the frontier. A reminder that before there was a clear America, there was a bloody, contested ground where loyalty was fluid, survival was paramount, and the line between civilization and savagery was drawn not in the soil, but in the human heart, and it was a line that was forever shifting, forever being crossed. His story is the shadow narrative of American expansion, a ghost in the triumphant story of manifest destiny, whispering that history is never as simple as the victors write it, and heroes and villains are often just men, shattered and remade by the unforgiving edges of a world being born.